Hello, parents and guardians, and welcome back to another Discipleship Debrief. This past Sunday, CBC Youth was going through Mark 14, 26 to 52, and there's a few kind of stories built up in these passages, the first of which being the disciples declaring very vehemently to Christ that they will not fall away from him, they will not run when he is captured, they will not leave, and Christ stating very plainly that yes, they will. It's prophesied to be such, and he knows that it will happen such. And then we have Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you have just the agony that he's in as he prepares for the cross, the pain, the torment of that. And then you also have at the same time the disciples failing him, and in him giving them the simple call of stay awake, keep watch, stay awake. And they time and time again fall asleep and they don't keep watch. And then lastly, you have Jesus being fully betrayed and handed over to the guards by Judas and being arrested. And so through these passages, we saw just the general theme of Christ's perseverance. The fact that Christ is allowing himself to go through all of this, he's submitting himself to all of this for the sake of God the Father, for his glory and for the sake of God's people, whom he's redeeming. And we see that he's perseverant through human failure, right? We see the disciples fail him. They say so vehemently that they will not flee from him. Peter, in fact, says that, Lord, I would rather die than flee from you. And then in, 14 verses later, he's fleeing with the rest of them, right? So he's failed by his friends. He's failed by them in the garden as well. All he asks is that they keep watch and they fall asleep. We see that he's perseverant through the horrors of the cross, right? He has this conversation with God the Father where he ultimately submits to God's will and submits himself to the cross, but he is terrified and he is agonizing over the pain and the sorrow of the sin that he will bear, over the separation from God the Father. Truly the worst imaginable punishment that he will receive as an innocent man. And he's agonizing over that, and he's distraught because of it, and he falls on his face in prayer, and he says he's sorrowful even unto death, and then he submits to it, and he perseveres through it for the sake of God and his glory and his people. It's incredible. And we saw that Christ was perseverant through injustice. The way he's arrested, first of all, it's unjust just because he's an innocent man being arrested for something he did not do. Second of all, it's unjust because, as Christ himself points out in verse 48, he's being arrested as if he's a robber, or as if he's violent, or as if he's a terrorist. They bring 600 armed soldiers to arrest Christ, a peaceful rabbi, who has done nothing but teach in the synagogues and teach in the streets. And they bring all these armed men. They're really like soiling his reputation and his perception of the people by treating him as they would any other terrorist or anything like that. And we'll look more at the injustice of Christ's arrest and trial next week, as we'll actually be going through the trial kind of piece by piece. But so we see Christ persevere, Christ's perseverance. And number one, this perseverance ought to really remind us just to be thankful to him, thankful that he submitted himself to all these things on our behalf. He did it all so that we would not have to do it, so that we could be God's people. That's incredible. May we never forget that. And on top of that, as the writer of Hebrews points out in chapter 12, I think it's specifically in verse 3, Christ is the ultimate example of perseverance to look to. As we persevere through things in life, we ought not to look to other people. We ought not to look to other people through history. We ought not to look to our friends, to our family. Really, first and foremost, we ought to look to Christ. He's the ultimate example of human perseverance. So with that in mind, I would advise that you do read Hebrews chapter 12, just verses 3 and 4 is kind of what we closed with. So read Hebrews chapter 12, verses 3 and 4, and ask your student, what are you persevering through right now? What do you feel like is a trial in your life, is a struggle in your life? What are you persevering through? And how can Christ's example help you in that perseverance? How can you look to Christ and his example for help in that perseverance? Something that I found very fascinating about Christ is he does not sugarcoat his situation. He is not a stoic. Christ acknowledges the horror of the cross. Christ acknowledges the failure of his disciples. Christ acknowledges the injustice of the way that he is arrested. And then he submits to all of it for the glory of God. And I really think that that is a way that we can persevere, and a way we ought to learn to persevere, is never to hide the injustice around us or to sugarcoat it or to say that we're fine, but to persevere for the glory of God. That is all I have for you this week. If you have any questions or concerns or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, see you next time.